The shot came without warning. One moment, the Rusty Nail Saloon was alive with the familiar sounds of a Wyoming winter night, the low murmur of tired men, the clink of glass on wood, the halting melody of a piano missing two keys. The next moment, the world collapsed into a single, deafening crack that silenced everything at once. Della Marsh hit the floorboards before the smoke even cleared from the barrel. She didn't scream. She simply folded the way a candle folds when the flame goes out quietly, completely without argument. The dark stain spreading across the bodice of her dress was the only color left in the room. For 3 full seconds, nobody breathed. Then a chair scraped in the far corner of the saloon. A man stood up from the shadows, unhurried, deliberate, as though he had been waiting for exactly this moment. He had known it was coming long before anyone else in the room.
Why did you do it?
He walked past the frozen patrons, past the overturned glass still rolling on the bar, past the girl on the floor. He walked directly to the heavy oak doors at the front of the saloon, reached out with both scarred hands, lifted the massive iron-reinforced timber crossbar from the wall and dropped it into the iron brackets with a sound like a judge's gavel coming down. He locked them all inside. Then he turned around. The lamplight caught his face for the first time, a long scar running from his left cheekbone down to the edge of his jaw. Pale eyes the color of a winter sky and an expression that contained no anger, no excitement, and no fear whatsoever. The man's name was Eli Cord, and Bitter Creek, Wyoming had just run out of places to hide. 6 hours earlier, the town had looked almost peaceful. Almost. Bitter Creek sat on the edge of a lucrative copper vein in the southeastern corner of Wyoming territory, and it existed for one purpose alone: to pull wealth out of the frozen earth and funnel it upward into the hands of a single man. The streets were unpaved mud that froze solid in November and turned treacherous in thaw. The buildings were false-fronted lumber affairs that leaned into each other for warmth. Coal smoke hung over everything from October through March, turning the snow gray the moment it touched the ground. The town's population numbered just under 400 souls. Miners, mostly, along with the merchants and workers who fed off the edges of the mining economy. They lived in company housing, shopped at the company store, and drank at the company saloon. They all worked directly or indirectly for Edmund Harlow, and every single one of them understood with the particular clarity that comes from watching what happens to people who forget it, that Edmund Harlow was not a man who tolerated dissent. Sheriff Cobb wore a badge that Edmund had purchased outright in the spring of 1879. The man was not without a certain low cunning, but courage was not among his qualities. He was useful precisely because he understood his limitations. He kept order among the miners during the week and disappeared reliably whenever the Harlow family required the kind of order that left marks. The Rusty Nail was the social center of Bitter Creek, which meant it was also the pressure valve. Men came here after 12-hour shifts to drink away the particular exhaustion of labor performed underground in the dark for wages that never quite added up to enough. The saloon was large by frontier standards, a long mahogany bar along the left wall, a scattering of round tables across the sawdust floor, a small raised platform in the back corner where a piano player named Clement worked 5 nights a week for tips and a hot meal. Gideon Pruitt had owned the Rusty Nail for 11 years. He was a broad-weathered man of 52 with a jaw carrying a scar from a cavalry saber that had come within a quarter inch of ending his life at Chickamauga 20 years prior. He had survived that war, survived the trail west, survived 2 winters that killed a dozen men around him, and he had built something here in this gray little town, something that required constant, careful management to keep standing. He watched over his establishment the way a man watches over a campfire in dry country, always aware of where the wind was coming from. He watched over Della Marsh the same way. Della had come to Bitter Creek 14 months ago on the stage from Laramie carrying a single carpet bag and a letter of introduction from a boarding house owner who vouched for her character. She was 22 years old with dark hair and a quality of stillness about her that was unusual in a woman her age. Not coldness, but a kind of deliberate composure, as though she had decided early that the world rewarded people who did not flinch. She was not a woman of the night. This distinction mattered to Gideon, and he had enforced it from her first week with the particular authority of a man who had nothing to prove. Della worked as a hostess and a dancer, She kept the men buying drinks, deflected their advances with a sharp wit and a sympathetic patience that kept them feeling seen without crossing any lines, and she worked 14-hour shifts without complaint. Every 2 weeks, she took a portion of her wages to the telegraph office on Clement Street and wired money to a Catholic orphanage in St. Louis, Missouri. She kept a small leather notebook in her apron pocket. In it, written in her careful, slanted hand, were the names of every child currently residing at St. Agatha's Home for Children 31, names updated each time a letter arrived from Sister Margaret. Her younger sister Clara, age 9, was the 4th name on the list. Della did not talk about Clara at work. She did not talk about St. Louis, or the notebook, or the reason she had left in the first place. She simply worked, and she sent the money, and she kept moving forward the way people do when stopping is not an option. Gideon knew all of this because Gideon paid attention. It was the quality that had kept him alive at Chickamauga. And it was the quality that kept the rusty nail standing now, and he applied it equally to both. He also knew on the evening of November the 14th that the man sitting alone in the far corner of his saloon was not a man to be taken lightly. The stranger had arrived 2 days prior on a roan gelding, a quality animal trail worn but well kept. He had paid for a room at the boarding house next door with raw gold dust, unrefined, the kind a man carries when he doesn't want the transaction recorded anywhere. He had not given a name at the livery or to Mrs. Aldrich at the boarding house. He had eaten 2 meals in silence, paid for his drinks water only, which was unusual enough to be noted, and had occupied the same corner table each evening without speaking to anyone. He wore a long trail coat, dark with weathering, and a wide-brimmed hat he kept pulled low. His boots were good quality beneath the dust. The Colt peacemaker on his right hip was not flashy. No silver plating, no engraving, just worn wooden grips smoothed by years of handling. It sat low and easy on his thigh, the way a tool sits, not a decoration. His hands, when they rested on the table, told a story of their own. They were large and heavily scarred across the knuckles and palms. Not the scars of a man who had worked with his hands in the ordinary sense, but the specific particular damage of a man who had used them in ways that left permanent records. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless in certain lights. When they moved across the room, which they did regularly, with the systematic patience of a man accustomed to assessing threats, they held the flat evaluative quality of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by what people were capable of. Gideon had watched him for 2 days and had reached a conclusion he shared with no one. This man was not passing through. This man was exactly where he intended to be. It was on the second evening, just as the early crowd was thinning toward the heavier drinkers, that the stranger did something that would stay with Gideon for the rest of his life. He caught Gideon's eye from across the room and gave a small, almost imperceptible tilt of his head, the universal signal of a man who wants a quiet word. Gideon came around from behind the bar, dried his hands on his apron, and walked to the corner table. Up close, the stranger was larger than he appeared from a distance, not in height, but in a quality of density of presence, as though the air around him had more weight than it did elsewhere. The stranger did not look up immediately. He finished whatever thought he was having, then raised those pale eyes to Gideon's face. "You've been watching me," he said. His voice was low, not a whisper, but contained the kind of voice shaped by years of speaking in places where being overheard had consequences. "It's my saloon," Gideon replied. "I watch everyone." The corner of the stranger's mouth moved not quite a smile. He reached into the inside pocket of his trail coat and produced a thick envelope sealed with plain wax and held it out between 2 fingers. Gideon took it without speaking. "If I have not ridden out of Bitter Creek by first light tomorrow morning," the stranger said, "that envelope needs to reach the governor's office in Cheyenne. There is a name and an address written on the inside flap. The man it's addressed to has been expecting it for 3 weeks. Gideon turned the envelope over in his hands. It was heavy. Whatever was inside had substance, not just paper. "And if you do ride out?" Gideon asked. "Then you keep it," the stranger said, "and we never had this conversation." He picked up his glass of water and looked back toward the room, which was the end of the conversation, as clearly as a door closing. Gideon stood there for a moment longer. He wanted to ask the obvious questions. "Who are you? What's in here? What are you planning? But he had run a frontier saloon for 11 years, and he had learned to read situations, and what he read in this one was simple and absolute. This man already knew exactly what was going to happen tonight, had already made his decisions about it, and the only question remaining was whether Gideon would do his part when the time came. He put the envelope in his apron pocket and walked back to the bar without another word. That was at 7:30 in the evening. At 9 o'clock, the doors of the Rusty Nails swung open. The blast of November air that came through the doors was sharp enough to make the candles gutter in their holders. The piano player fumbled his notes and stopped. The low current of conversation died, the way conversations die when something instinctively understood as dangerous enters a room. Preston Harlow stepped inside. He was 24 years old, Edmund Harlow's only son and sole heir to the copper empire that owned this town. He wore a tailored broadcloth suit ordered from a Denver tailor, costing more than most men in this room made in 2 months. His boots were hand-tooled leather without a scuff on them despite the snow outside, which meant someone had cleaned them before he left the house. On his right hip sat a silver-plated Colt revolver, customized, engraved the kind of weapon purchased to be looked at, rather than used. He was already drunk. The flush across his cheeks and the particular glassiness of his eyes told the story clearly. Not the first drink of the evening, not even the third. His face carried the expression of a young man raised to believe that every room he entered should rearrange itself in his honor, and who became dangerous in precise proportion to the degree that it failed to do so. Behind him came Rake and Colton, his personal bodyguards, 2 hardened men who had done work for the Harlow family that went well beyond what their official title implied. Rake was wide through the shoulders, with small, watchful eyes set close together. Colton was leaner, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that the most effective violence is performed without warning and without emotion. They took up positions flanking Preston as he surveyed the room. The miners at the bar lowered their eyes. This was not cowardice exactly. It was the pragmatic calculus of men with families and mortgages on company houses and no realistic alternatives. Looking away from Preston Harlow was a survival skill in Bitter Creek, practiced and refined over years. Gideon's hand moved below the bar to the stock of his sawed-off shotgun. Colton's eyes moved to him immediately, flat and unreadable, and rested there, a clear statement of consequence that required no words. Gideon's hand stopped moving. Preston moved through the room toward the back, his expensive boots thudding on the floorboards, his eyes scanning until they found what they were looking for. Della was wiping down a table near the far wall. She heard the boots. She heard the particular quality of silence that had descended over the room. And she knew the way women who work frontier saloons develop a sense for certain kinds of approaching weather, exactly what was coming before she turned around. She straightened, smoothed her skirts, and turned around with the professional composure that 14 months of navigating rooms like this had given her. "Good evening, Mr. Harlow." Her voice was even, practiced. "Can I get you something from the bar?" "I don't want anything from the bar." Preston crossed the remaining distance between them in 4 steps. He was smiling, but it was the smile of a man enjoying something the other person had not yet understood they were part of. "I want to dance Della." "It's been a long shift," she said. She kept her voice pleasant, kept the professional arrangement of her expression in place the way a person keeps their footing on ice carefully with full awareness of how quickly things can go wrong. "I'm about to finish up for the evening. Let me get you a bottle of the good rye." "I didn't ask about your shift." The smile sharpened into something uglier. He reached out and took her wrist. His grip was too tight, not by accident. "I said I want to dance." She tried to withdraw her arm. He tightened his grip. The room was absolutely silent now. 40 men watching, not one of them moving. Gideon had gone pale behind the bar. The piano player had his hands in his lap and his eyes on the floor. "Let go of my arm, Preston." The pleasantness was gone from her voice now. Not anger, something quieter than anger and more resolute. "I am not going to dance with you." Something crossed Preston's face, a brief ugly flash of the thing that lived underneath the arrogance. Being refused by a saloon girl in front of his men, in front of the miners who worked for his father. The humiliation of it ignited the drunk and dangerous part of his brain. You work in my father's saloon, he said, his voice dropping to a hiss that carried despite its quietness. You live in my father's town. When I tell you to dance, no. One word. Quiet and final, the way a door closes on a cold night. Preston's face went through several changes in rapid succession. Surprise, disbelief, and then a hot blind fury that had no room in it for calculation. He released her wrist, stepped back, and in one lurching motion driven by wounded pride and too much whiskey, his hand dropped to his silver-plated Colt, and he drew it. He did not aim. He was too drunk and too furious to aim. He simply raised the barrel in her general direction and pulled the trigger. The sound inside the wooden walls was catastrophic. The muzzle flash lit the shocked faces of the crowd in a single white instant. Della gasped a small, bewildered sound and looked down at her chest with an expression of pure confusion, as though she had been told something in a language she couldn't quite make sense of. The dark stain began spreading immediately across the front of her dress. She swayed. Her knees gave out. She went down onto the sawdust-covered floor without another sound. Gideon cleared the bar, vaulting it with a speed that surprised everyone, including himself. But Rake already had his pistol drawn and leveled at the bartender's chest before his feet hit the ground. The hammer was back. The message was clear. Gideon stopped where he stood. Preston stood in the center of the room, his smoking gun in his hand, staring at what he had done. For just a moment, a single, honest moment, the arrogance was stripped away, and there was only a young man's horror at the consequence of one terrible second. Then he looked up and saw the 40 faces staring at him, pale and frozen with fear, and the horror curdled into something else. Something that looked, God help him, like relief that the room had finally arranged itself according to his expectations. "Anybody else tired tonight?" Preston said. His voice was unsteady, but he forced a grin. He spun the revolver on his finger, a practiced gesture rehearsed in private, and slid it back into the holster. "I didn't think so." He turned toward the door. Rake and Colton fell in behind him. They made it 3 steps. The sound of a single chair scraping across floorboards echoed from the far corner of the room. Everyone turned. Eli Cord stood up from the shadows. He did not move quickly. He moved the way water moves when it finds a crack in stone, with an unhurried certainty, following a path already determined. He walked past the cowering patrons, past Gideon frozen by the bar, past Della lying on the floor, and here, just for a fraction of a second, his pace slowed almost imperceptibly, and something moved across his face that was private and unreadable and gone before it could be named. He walked to the heavy oak doors, reached out with both scarred hands, and lifted the iron crossbar from its bracket on the wall. He set it across the iron mounts with a sound that was final and absolute, a sound that rearranged without any ambiguity whatsoever the terms of the situation. He turned around. The lamplight caught him fully now. The long scar, the pale eyes, the worn peacemaker sitting low on his right hip, the grip smoothed by a decade of use. Preston's smirk remained, but it had less certainty in it than a moment ago. "You got a death wish, old man?" Eli did not respond to this. He looked slowly and methodically around the room at the miners pressed against the walls, at Gideon still half crouched by the bar, at Rake and Colton with their hands drifting toward iron. Then he looked at the floor where Della lay. "Is she breathing?" Gideon dropped to his knees beside her, pressed both hands over the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and steady. "She's alive. Barely. She needs the doctor. Right now." "Nobody leaves," Eli said, "until the debt is paid." Colton made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You're one man. We're 3, and that boy there is the son of the man who owns every inch of ground in this valley." He took a measured step forward, his hand resting on his iron. "Unlock that door. Last chance, friend." Eli looked at him with the patient, evaluating expression of a man reading a document he has already read before. "3 men. He said, his voice carrying across the dead quiet room without effort. "I see a frightened boy playing with his father's property. I see 2 men who shoot dirt farmers in the back for monthly wages. And I see a room full of men who've been standing in the cold so long they've forgotten what warmth feels like." He paused. His pale eyes moved to Preston. "Your father, Edmund Harlow. Tell me something, boy, does he still walk with a limp in his left leg? The color left Preston's face so completely and so quickly that several men near him instinctively stepped back as though illness might be contagious. The smirk was gone as though it had never existed. How do you know about 1864? Eli said. He let the year stand alone in the air of the saloon for a moment, the way you let a stone settle after dropping it into deep water. Sand Creek. He continued, his voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous than before. A lieutenant named Edmund Harlow caught shrapnel in his left knee on a November morning while his men were doing things I won't describe in detail to his son. I was a federal land surveyor working under government contract. I watched your father make choices that day that a man doesn't watch, and then forget. He took one slow, measured step forward. The space between him and the three men was now less than 15 feet. And then your father shot me in the back, left me for dead in the snow, and used the land deed he pulled from my coat pocket to build the empire you were born into. Preston's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Your son just tried to murder an unarmed woman. Eli said the words, level and unhurried, because she said no to a dance. That's what 19 years of your father's empire has produced. He paused again. I think it's time we settled accounts. Colton moved first. What followed was not a gunfight in any conventional sense, not the squared-off cold shot affair of legend. It was a sequence of events that occurred with a speed and economy that the human eye could track only in fragments, the way you track lightning by the gaps it leaves in the dark. Colton's hand dropped to his iron. Eli's right hand moved. The peacemaker came level, and the sound was a continuous roll of thunder. Not two separate reports, but one sustained percussion, the product of a man who has practiced a thing so many thousands of times that thought no longer mediates between intention and execution. Colton went backward over a card table which collapsed beneath him. Rake managed to clear leather. He was fast, genuinely, professionally fast. The kind of fast that had kept him employed in dangerous work for the better part of 15 years. He got his barrel up. Eli had already pivoted. The second report. Rake went down hard, his unfired gun clattering across the floorboards. 2 men. Less than 3 seconds. The saloon fell back into a silence so complete it had physical presence, a ringing, suffocating quiet, broken only by the moan of the blizzard against the shattered windows and the small involuntary sounds of 40 men who had been holding their breath. Eli stood where he had stood. His peacemaker was still leveled, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel, pointing directly at Preston Harlow's chest. Preston was on his knees. He had not drawn his silver-plated Colt. He appeared to have forgotten it existed. His hands were raised and shaking so violently, his teeth chattered and his face was wet. Whether from tears or cold sweat was difficult to determine, and it didn't particularly matter. Please. The word came out broken, barely recognizable as language. Please, I'll pay my father, we'll pay anything you want. Gold land, just name it. Eli stepped over Rake's body. He crossed the room until he stood directly over Preston, looking down at him with the expression of a man who has arrived after a very long journey at a destination. I don't deal in your father's gold, Eli said quietly. I deal in what's owed. He held the gun steady for 10 long seconds. The room held its collective breath. Then slowly he uncocked the hammer. You're going to live, he said, but not as you are. Before Preston could fully process the reprieve, Eli's boot moved a single precise strike to the right knee. The sound of the joint giving way was sickening and complete. Preston's scream was the loudest sound the rusty nail had produced all evening, and it echoed off the low ceiling and the broken windows and the frozen faces of the men who stood witness. When it faded, the room was very quiet. Eli holstered his gun. He walked to the heavy oak doors, lifted the iron bar, and set it aside. He pulled the door open. The blizzard came through immediately, cold and indifferent and cleansing. Someone get the doctor, he said to the room at large. Now. 2 men broke for the door before he'd finished the sentence. Eli walked back to his corner table and sat down. He reached into his coat pocket and found the smooth, flat stone he had carried for 19 years, dark granite, the size of his palm, worn to a perfect smoothness. He set it on the table in front of him and looked at it. Not at the room. Not at the chaos beginning to reorganize itself around Della Marsh on the floor. Just at the stone, as though taking a measurement of something internal that only he could read. Outside at the far end of Main Street, lights burned in the upper windows of the Harlow estate, the sprawling Victorian mansion, perched on its hill above the town, looking down at everything Edmund Harlow owned, which was everything. For now. Eli looked at those distant lights for a long moment. Then he put the stone back in his pocket, folded his scarred hands on the table and waited. Outside, the blizzard deepened over Bitter Creek, and somewhere in the lit windows on the hill, door slammed open. The Harlow estate sat above Bitter Creek like a pronouncement. It was a Victorian structure, 3 stories of imported lumber and brick-gabled roof lines, a wraparound porch that nobody used in winter. Tall windows positioned to look down on the grey rooftops and coal smoke of the mining town below. Edmund Harlow had built it in 1871, the year the first real money came out of the copper vein, and he had built it large and prominent on purpose. A man's house in Edmund's philosophy was a statement of capability. It was supposed to make people feel small when they looked up at it. Most of the time it worked. Tonight the lights in the upper floor burned at an hour when they were usually dark, and the man standing in the master bedroom was not a man who accepted disruption to his routines with any measure of grace. Edmund Harlow was 61 years old. He had been a large man once, broad through the chest, the kind of physical presence that fills a room without trying. Age had stripped some of that away, leaving behind something harder and more concentrated like ore after smelting. His beard was thick and streaked heavily with grey. His eyes were the color of old iron and carried the same quality, cold, functional, and without warmth. He stood at the window looking down at the lights of the Rusty Nail, and he listened to Sheriff Cobb deliver the news. Cobb was a small, perpetually damp man who sweated regardless of the temperature. He was sweating now, standing near the doorway with his hat clutched in both hands, turning it in nervous rotations the way a man turns a crank when the machinery won't respond. "Your son is alive," Cobb said for the second time, as though repetition might soften the surrounding information. "Doc Halverson has the leg set and splinted. There will be a permanent limitation, the doc says. The knee is—" "I heard you," Edmund said without turning from the window. Cobb fell silent. The room was expensively furnished. Persian rugs, mahogany pieces, oil paintings of eastern landscapes that bore no resemblance to Wyoming. A crystal decanter of whiskey sat on the sideboard catching the lamplight. Edmund had not touched it. He stood at the window with both hands clasped behind his back, looking at the town below with the expression of a man performing a calculation involving variables he does not yet fully understand. "The girl," Edmund said. "Doc Halverson is with her now. They believe she'll survive. The bullet missed the—" "I don't require details about the girl," Edmund said. He said it the way a man notes the weather as simple information relevant to planning. "What I require is an accounting of a man who killed 2 of my people, put my son on a surgeon's table, and has apparently not seen fit to vacate my town." Cobb swallowed visibly. "He's still in the Rusty Nail, sir. Pruitt has the doors locked from the inside now, but the men who came out the back report the stranger is just sitting there, by the stove, drinking coffee." Edmund turned from the window. This was the quality about Edmund Harlow, that men who underestimated him tended to discover too late. The moments that made other men reactive and loud made Edmund very, very quiet. The fury was there. It was always there, banked and controlled like a furnace that has been running long enough that the walls themselves sustain the heat. But it was fury that had been refined over 6 decades into something patient and calculating, and therefore genuinely dangerous. He walked to the chair beside his son's bed and looked down at Preston. The young man was sedated heavily with laudanum. Doc Halverson had administered enough to keep him under until morning. His right leg was splinted from ankle to mid-thigh and bound with white linen already showing bruising at the knee. His face in sleep was younger looking than in waking softer. And for just a moment something moved across Edmund's expression that might in another man have been grief. Then it was gone, the way smoke clears. Edmund's left knee ached with the deep, specific persistence that cold weather always drew out of it. He had carried that ache for 19 years, a permanent souvenir from a November morning in the Colorado Territory that he had long since decided to stop thinking about. He had made his decisions that day. He had made them quickly, as important decisions must be made, and he had built everything he owned on the foundation of those decisions. The land deed, the copper claim, the town, the estate, the empire, all of it traced back to a single morning in the snow, and a single man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. A land surveyor, a federal contractor, a man he had shot and left for dead. Edmund had stopped thinking about that man approximately 15 years ago because thinking about him served no productive purpose. The man was dead. Edmund had watched him fall. The snow had been very deep that year. "Who is he?" Edmund said quietly, turning from his son's bed to face Cobb. "The drifter. What does anyone know?" "Nobody knows anything certain, sir." Cobb was choosing his words with the care of a man walking across ice he cannot see the thickness of. "He rode in 2 days ago, paid in raw gold, no name given anywhere. The miners are calling him the Colorado Ghost because of what he said to Preston about Sand Creek and the Colorado Volunteers." He hesitated. "There's talk that he knew details about that morning that—" "There is always talk," Edmund said, cutting him off. "Talk is what people who don't act produce in place of action." He moved to the sideboard, poured 2 fingers of whiskey, and stood looking at it without drinking. "What I know is that a nameless man rode into my town with gold dust and no name, and within 48 hours he has killed 2 of my men and put my son in a surgeon's bed. That is not the behavior of a drifter." He set the glass down without touching it. "That is the behavior of a man who came here for a specific purpose." Cobb had nothing useful to offer in response to this. Edmund walked to the window again. The town below was quieter now. The chaos that had erupted after the shooting at the Rusty Nail was settling into the particular stillness of a community that has witnessed something it is still processing. A few lights moved through the dark streets. The blizzard was thickening. "Send for Dade Voss," Edmund said. The effect on Cobb was immediate and visible. The sheriff's already pale face went another shade lighter, and the hat-turning intensified. "Mr. Harlow Voss has 20 men out at the camp, armed with Winchesters, most of them. If you send them into Main Street, the crossfire alone could—" "The crossfire," Edmund said with a patience that was more frightening than anger would have been, "is not my concern. This town exists because I built it. Every man in it works because I permit him to. If some of them get caught in the middle of my business, that is a consequence of their proximity." He turned from the window. "Tell Voss I want the saloon surrounded before midnight. Tell him the man inside doesn't leave. Tell him—" He paused, and what passed across his face in that pause was something cold and absolute. "Tell him I want the building taken, however that requires." Cobb opened his mouth. "That will be all, Sheriff," Edmund said. Cobb left. Edmund stood alone in the room with his unconscious son, and the sound of the blizzard against the tall windows. He looked at Preston for a long moment, at the slack young face, at the ruined leg, at the silver-plated Colt, still sitting in its holster on the bedside table where someone had placed it. He reached out and picked up the gun. He turned it over in his hands, felt the engraving, the custom grip panels, the weight of it. He had given Preston this gun on his 21st birthday, had told him that a man in their position needed to understand what he was carrying and what it meant. Clearly, the lesson had not fully taken. Edmund set the gun back on the table. He walked to his writing desk, opened the lower drawer, and removed a folded piece of paper that he had not looked at in several years. He unfolded it carefully, smoothed it on the desk, and looked at it. It was a hand-drawn map of the Sand Creek area, as it had appeared in the autumn of 1864. Rough but accurate, marked with survey points and compass bearings. And in the lower right corner, a federal contractor's notation in careful handwriting. He had kept it because destroying it had always seemed like a more definitive action than he was ready to take. He had kept it the way certain men keep certain things as proof to themselves that what they had done had been real and had mattered. He studied the handwriting in the corner for a long time. Then he folded the map, put it back in the drawer, and closed it. He went to bed. He did not sleep. At the Rusty Nail, the hours between 10 and midnight moved with the particular slowness of time experienced under threat. Gideon Pruitt had sent the two fastest men in the saloon running for Doc Halverson the moment Eli opened the doors, and Halverson had arrived within 12 minutes, a small, precise man of 60, who had spent 20 years as a battlefield surgeon in the Confederate Medical Corps, and who approached crisis with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen considerably worse. He knelt beside Della, assessed the wound, and began working without preamble. The bullet had entered below her left collarbone, shattered a rib, and lodged close to her lung without penetrating it. A margin, Halverson said, without looking up from his work, of approximately 3/4 of an inch. She had lost significant blood. Her breathing was shallow but regular. He could not move her to the clinic until she was stable enough to survive the cold outside. He worked on her on the saloon floor, using the bar as a surgical table for his instruments, while around him the remaining patrons gradually sorted themselves into two groups: those who slipped out the back door and into the storm, and those who stayed, held by some combination of shock and a reluctance to leave that they could not quite articulate. Eli stayed at his corner table through all of it. He watched Halverson work. He watched the patrons drift. He watched Gideon move behind the bar with the methodical focus of a man who processes difficulty through action, wiping down the mahogany restacking glasses, doing the small, routine things that assert normalcy against the evidence of the room. Around 11, Gideon came to his table. He set down a cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the watered-down version served to the regular trade, and stood there for a moment before sitting down across from Eli uninvited. Eli did not object. "You should have ridden out," Gideon said. Not as an accusation, as a statement of fact offered between men who understand each other's calculations. "Doc says she's holding. You bought her that chance. Edmund Harlow is going to bring something down on this street that a man can't outrun on a roan horse in a blizzard." Eli wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The warmth of it against his scarred palms was specific and real. "A man can't outrun his past," he said. "He can only wait for it to catch up and look it straight in the eye." Gideon studied him for a moment. "This isn't only about the girl." "It was never only about the girl," Eli said. "She was an innocent caught in the crossfire of arrogant men, the same as she always is in places like this. But my business in Bitter Creek started 19 years ago." He looked at the coffee. "I've been working my way back to it ever since." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Outside, the blizzard had reached a full howl, the kind of Wyoming storm that makes the world contract to the size of whatever shelter you're standing in. "The envelope I gave you," Eli said, "still in my apron. Keep it there. If this goes wrong tonight, it goes to Cheyenne. If it doesn't," he picked up the coffee cup, "then I'll take it myself in the morning." "And if you're not in a condition to take it anywhere?" Gideon asked. Eli looked at him with those pale winter sky eyes. "Then use your judgment," he said. It was shortly after midnight that they heard it, the crunch of boots on frozen snow, organized and rhythmic, coming from the direction of Main Street. Not one man, or three. Many men moving in formation with the particular cadence of people who have done this kind of approach before and understand the geometry of it. Gideon went to the window. The sight that met him was not unexpected, but it was still something to see. 20 men had fanned out across Main Street in a wide semicircle, anchoring at the corners of the buildings on either side of the Rusty Nail. They moved with the efficient, unhurried confidence of men who had done siege work before and who understood that time and numbers were both on their side. Winchester repeaters, most of them the lever-action kind that could put 15 rounds down range before the first man's empty hit the ground. At the center of the line stood Dade Voss. Voss was a substantial man, not tall, but built through the chest and shoulders in a way that suggested considerable structural integrity, the kind of frame that had absorbed a great deal of difficulty over the years and had incorporated the experience rather than being diminished by it. He wore a long, fur-lined duster and a flat-brimmed hat that he kept level regardless of the wind. He had been a Pinkerton detective for 11 years before the agency had terminated him, following events during the railroad strikes of '77 that the agency preferred not to have associated with its name. Since then, he had provided what he described as private security consultation to men of means who required the kind of problem-solving that preferred to remain off the public record. He had worked for Edmund Harlow for 3 years. It was the longest employment relationship he had maintained since the Pinkertons, and he valued it for the same reason he had valued the detective agency. It provided legitimate cover for a skill set that had limited applications in polite society. Behind him, Edmund Harlow's horse-drawn sleigh had arrived and stopped at the near end of Main Street. Edmund stepped out slowly, leaning on his silver-tipped cane, his bearskin coat pulled close. He moved to a position just behind Voss's line, out of direct line of sight from the saloon windows, and stood with the stillness of a man who has decided what is going to happen and is simply waiting for the world to complete the process. His left knee ached in the cold. It always ached in the cold. "Drifter." Edmund's voice, when he raised it, was a remarkable instrument, deep and carrying, shaped by decades of addressing men who needed to understand that he was not asking. It cut through the wind and the snow and the walls of the saloon with clarifying precision. "You have made your point. You have demonstrated that you are capable of considerable violence. I acknowledge this. Now open those doors and come out, and I will give you the courtesy of a clean rope rather than the alternative." Inside the rusty nail, Gideon looked at Eli. Eli had already stood. He was looking around the room with the systematic efficiency of a man who had been planning this in some form for considerably longer than tonight. "Get everyone to the cellar," he said. His voice was completely steady. "The trap door behind the bar. Take whatever you can carry down there and pull it closed above you." "I fought at Shiloh." Gideon set his jaw tight. "I don't go to ground." Eli looked at him. "You have a saloon to rebuild and a girl who's going to need someone to look after her when she wakes up. This is my war, Gideon. Not yours. Not hers. Mine." He placed a hand briefly on the older man's shoulder, a gesture that was both an acknowledgement and a dismissal. "Go." Gideon held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and began moving the remaining men toward the bar. Doc Halverson refused to go below. "I'm not leaving my patient," he said simply. And that was the end of it. Eli looked at him. The small, precise surgeon crouched beside Della's improvised bed and made a decision. "Stay away from the windows," he said. "Both of you." He turned back to the room. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried purpose, the efficiency of a man working a plan he has thought through completely. He went to the bar and retrieved 3 kerosene lanterns, dark, and positioned them near the front windows without lighting them. He examined the structural pillars running down the center of the room, noting their positions. He looked up at the massive elk antler chandelier suspended above the center of the floor, a substantial thing, iron-framed and heavy, connected to the ceiling by a single bolted bracket. He looked at the bracket for a moment. Then he went to the back door, cracked it an inch, and let the freezing wind begin pushing through the building, a slow, cold current that shifted the air, moved the dust, and began to establish a cross-flow that would affect visibility in very specific ways once the shooting started. He retrieved his peacemaker, checked the cylinder, and reloaded the spent chambers with the calm, precise attention of a man performing a familiar task. He found his position behind the structural pillar nearest the back wall in the region of deepest shadow created by the cross-flow of cold air and lamp smoke. He waited. "Time's up," Edmund called from the street. The words were almost pleasant, the tone of a man who has been patient and considers his patience to have been adequate. "Voss, proceed." The eruption of gunfire that followed was genuinely deafening. 20 Winchester repeaters firing simultaneously produced a sustained physical impact, not merely sound. The front facade of the rusty nail disintegrated. The large windows exploded inward in cascades of deadly glass. The double doors were reduced to splintered wreckage in the first 3 seconds. Wood shrieked and splintered along the entire front wall. The piano Clement's 2-key short instrument that had played its last note of the evening at 9 o'clock came apart in a spray of wire and soundboard. The barrage sustained for 60 full seconds. Then Voss called ceasefire. The silence that followed had a ringing cottony quality, the auditory aftermath of extreme noise. Smoke drifted from the ruined facade. Snow was already beginning to drift through the shattered openings. "He's finished," one of Voss's men said from the street. "Nobody lives through that." "Go confirm it," Voss said. He kicked through what remained of the double doors, with 5 men following closely behind. Good men. Experienced men, the kind of professionals who don't make the basic error of assuming that silence means safety. They spread out inside the ruined saloon, moving through the dust and debris with their Winchesters up. The interior was chaos, shredded canvas, broken furniture, the heavy smell of cordite and fresh wood splinter. The dust raised by the barrage, combined with the cold crossflow Eli had established through the back door, created a visibility problem that worsened as they moved deeper into the room. "Spread out," Voss said quietly. "Find him." The first shot came from the darkness to the left of the rear pillar. The man to Voss's immediate left went down without a sound, a clean single shot, nothing wasted. Panic moved through the group like electricity. The men began firing into the shadows, but there was no target, only muzzle flash, and the sound of movement that seemed to come from multiple positions simultaneously. Eli was not in multiple positions. He was moving in a deliberate pattern along the back wall, using the pillars and the darkness and the confusion of 5 men in an unfamiliar space to create the impression of several opponents where there was only one. It was a technique that required specific conditions. Limited visibility, enclosed space, men accustomed to confronting threats they can see. And he had been setting up those conditions since the moment he cracked the back door. A second man went down. A third. Voss, to his credit, did not panic. He dropped behind the remains of a card table, gathered his 2 remaining men with hand signals, and began moving methodically toward the back of the room. He was good. He understood what was happening, a single opponent using terrain and psychology, and he was adjusting his approach with the professional competence of someone who had handled unexpected situations before. He was not, however, accounting for the chandelier. Eli came around the far side of the rear pillar, raised his peacemaker, and fired once at the iron bracket, connecting the chandelier to the ceiling beam above the position where Voss and his 2 remaining men were converging. The bracket gave. The chandelier, 140 pounds of iron framework and elk antler, came down with a crash that shook the floor. It caught both of Voss's remaining men under its frame, pinning them effectively and completely. Voss rolled clear by a matter of feet. He came up with his Winchester leveled, scanning. Eli stepped out from behind the pillar. They were 20 feet apart. The air between them was thick with dust and gun smoke, but there was enough lamplight filtering through the destruction to see clearly. Voss looked at him. Eli looked at Voss. "You're better than I expected," Voss said. His breathing was controlled. His Winchester was steady. "I'll give you that. You're better than most," Eli replied. "I'll give you that." A pause. The wind moved through the ruined saloon. "Edmund told me you were dead," Voss said. "Sand Creek, 1864. He was very specific about it. He was wrong, obviously." Voss's eyes did not move from Eli's face. "He also told me something else. 2 nights ago, when he gave me the job." He paused. "He told me that when it was done, when you were finished, I was to make sure there were no additional loose ends." His words. Another pause. "He put me in the category of loose end." Eli said nothing. He watched Voss's hands. "I found the written order in Cobb's coat pocket 3 hours ago," Voss said. "Edmund likes paper trails for other people's obligations. He's less careful about his own." He lowered the Winchester, not dropping it, not surrendering it, but bringing it down to a position that was no longer a direct threat. I'm not dying in a Wyoming blizzard for a man who already signed my death warrant. Eli kept his peacemaker level for a moment longer. Then slowly he lowered it. The men under the chandelier, he said. Alive, Voss said. Both of them, bruised considerably. Eli nodded once. Then we're done in here. He turned and walked toward what remained of the front of the saloon. Behind him he heard Voss begin the work of getting his men free of the chandelier frame, methodical, professional, without complaint. At the ruined doorway, Eli paused. He looked back once at the room, at the devastation, at the two men pinned under the iron frame, at the body of the man he'd shot near the entrance. At the makeshift surgical area behind the bar, where Doc Halverson was still crouched over Della, having not moved, having shielded her with his own body throughout the entire engagement. Eli looked at the old surgeon for a long moment. Halverson looked back at him over his shoulder. He gave a single small nod. Della was still breathing. Eli walked out through the ruined doors and into the street. Main Street was nearly empty. The men who had made up Voss's line had, in the minutes following the cessation of shooting, made the calculation that professionals make when the arithmetic of a situation shifts decisively against them. They had collected themselves and their equipment and departed in the direction of the camp on the edge of town with the efficiency of people who understand that the employer-employee relationship has certain limits and that mortality is one of them. Sheriff Cobb had made a similar calculation approximately 20 minutes earlier and had made it faster. What remained on Main Street was the wind, the snow, and Edmund Harlow. He stood at the near end of the street alone, his silver-tipped cane planted in the snow. His bearskin coat open despite the cold. He had not moved from this position through the entirety of what had happened inside the Rusty Nail. He had listened to it, the gunfire, the crash of the chandelier, the subsequent silence, and he had remained where he stood with the particular stillness of a man who has decided at some point in the last hour that running is no longer an option worth considering. The first gray light of a Wyoming dawn was beginning somewhere behind the cloud cover, not visible yet, but present as a slight grudging lessening of the darkness. The blizzard had dropped from its peak to a steady, purposeful push of wind and snow that moved in long curtains across the deserted street. Eli walked out of the ruined Rusty Nail and across the boardwalk and down the 2 steps to the street. His boots made clean, deliberate prints in the fresh snow as he crossed toward Edmund. He stopped 10 feet away. They looked at each other across that distance. Edmund's face in the thin pre-dawn light was the face of a man at the end of a very long road. Not broken, that was not a word that applied to Edmund Harlow, and would not apply to him regardless of what happened in the next few minutes. But the particular quality of controlled invincibility that he had carried for 6 decades had shifted in some fundamental way, like a structural element that has been under too much load for too long and has finally reached its limit. "Your men are gone," Eli said. "I can see that." Edmund's voice was steady, professionally so. "Voss, he made his own decision. His men under the chandelier are alive." Eli paused. "The others weren't." Edmund absorbed this. His jaw tightened fractionally. "He was the best I had." "I know," Eli said. "I knew that before tonight. I've been watching your operation for 4 years, Edmund. I know who Voss was. I know what he was for. I know about the 3 claim jumpers your men disposed of in the spring of 1877 and about the false land filings you submitted to the federal office in Cheyenne in 1871 and about the bribery payments to 3 territorial officials that ran from 1873 to 1879. He reached into his coat's inner pocket and produced a folded document, thick, multi-paged, folded tight. All of it is in that envelope Gideon Pruitt is carrying in his apron pocket. Copies of the originals which are already in the hands of a federal attorney in Cheyenne. He's been sitting on them for 3 weeks, waiting for my signal." Edmund looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. "You've been building this for 4 years, he said finally. 19, Eli said. "Building it for 4. The first 15 I was just surviving." Something moved in Edmund's eyes, not guilt exactly, but the recognition of a truth that has been carefully suppressed for a very long time and has finally been allowed under sufficient external pressure to surface. "You should have stayed dead," Edmund said. There was no malice in it. It was simply a statement of the way things would have been preferable to Edmund Harlow, offered with the same flat pragmatism he might have applied to any business observation. "I tried," Eli said. "It didn't take." He took one step forward. The thin pre-dawn light caught his face fully, the long scar running from his left cheekbone to his jaw, the pale gray eyes, the specific topography of a face that had been left in the snow of the Colorado Territory on a November morning in 1864, and had then, against every reasonable probability, gotten back up. He watched Edmund's face. He watched the moment of full recognition move through the older man like a current, starting in the eyes, traveling through the jaw, spreading into the hands, until the silver-tipped cane trembled slightly in Edmund's grip. He watched Edmund's face move through 4 distinct expressions in the space of 5 seconds. And the last one, the one that settled and held, was something Eli had not anticipated. It was not defiance. It was not rage or denial or the arrogant dismissal of a powerful man confronted with inconvenient truth. It was exhaustion. The profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has been maintaining a lie for 19 years and has finally reached the end of the effort required to sustain it. "I told myself you were dead," Edmund said. His voice, for the first time in the conversation, had lost its professional steadiness. "I told myself the snow—" He stopped. "I told myself it was finished. For 19 years I told myself it was finished." "It wasn't finished," Eli said. "It was waiting." Edmund's right hand began to move a slow, deliberate motion toward the front of his bearskin coat. "Don't," Eli said quietly. Edmund's hand stopped. "The derringer in your left breast pocket," Eli said. "The knife in your right boot. I know about both of them. I know about both of them because I have spent 4 years learning everything there is to know about you, Edmund, where you go, who you trust, what you keep close, what you're afraid of." He paused. "What I've learned is that you're not afraid of very much. But you are afraid of this." A long silence. The wind moved between them, carrying snow. Edmund's hand dropped away from his coat. "So," he said, "what happens now? You shoot me in the street." "No," Eli said. Edmund blinked, the first involuntary reaction he had shown. "No, I spent 19 years thinking about putting a bullet in you," Eli said. "I had a lot of time to think lying in the snow after you rode away. I thought about it every day for years. And somewhere around the 4th or 5th year, I can't remember exactly when I understood something." He reached into his coat pocket and found the smooth granite stone. He held it without showing it, just felt the weight of it in his palm. "Killing you doesn't give me back the years. It doesn't give me back the land. It doesn't build anything. It's just the last thing you ever caused to happen, making me into something I wasn't before you shot me." Edmund stared at him. "The federal marshals out of Cheyenne received my signal 3 days ago," Eli continued. "They will be here by midday. The documentation in that envelope details every fraudulent filing, every bribe, every disposal of inconvenient people your operation has required in 20 years. The copper claim reverts to federal jurisdiction pending a full audit of the original filing. Your accounts at the Laramie Bank have been flagged for federal review." He paused. "Your empire, Edmund, is already gone. It was gone before tonight. Tonight was just the conclusion of accounts." Edmund stood in the snow and said nothing for a long moment. The cane in his hand trembled slightly. His left knee ached, as it had ached every cold morning for 19 years and would continue to ache for whatever mornings remained to him. "My son," he said finally. The word came out differently than any other word he had spoken tonight, quieter, carrying a weight that his professional voice was not designed to carry. "Preston is alive," Eli said. "He'll carry a limp for the rest of his life." Something crossed Edmund's face at that. Something that was perhaps the closest thing to irony that Edmund Harlow was capable of experiencing, the understanding that his son now bore the same damage in the same leg that he himself had carried for 19 years. The symmetry of it had its own particular judgment. "He made a terrible decision tonight," Eli said. "He's 24 years old, and he made it inside an education you provided. That's not absolution, but it's context." He held Edmund's gaze. "What he does with what's left of his life is up to him. That's more than you gave me." Footsteps behind him. Eli did not turn around. The footsteps were uneven, one solid one, dragging, and they came from the direction of the Harlow estate at the end of the street. Eli had heard them start about 40 seconds ago, coming down the hill road, and he had tracked them without looking the way a man tracks sound when turning would be inadvisable. Edmund looked past Eli. His expression changed in a way that was difficult to categorize. Surprise, something that might have been the very beginning of shame. And beneath it, an ancient buried thing that was perhaps the last remnant of whatever he had been before Bitter Creek and the copper vein and the carefully constructed edifice of Edmund Harlow. Father. The voice was young and tired, and carried the specific quality of someone who has been awake all night, having a very important conversation with himself. Preston Harlow came to a stop at Eli's shoulder. He was on a rough crutch, a length of wood that Halverson must have fashioned from debris, because he had been in no condition to produce one himself. His right leg was heavily wrapped. His face was pale and marked by the traces of the night's events, but his eyes were clear in a way that they had not been at any point in the Rusty Nails several hours earlier. He looked at his father. "Preston," Edmund said. His voice was careful. "Go back inside. This is—" "I know what this is," Preston said. He was not loud. Loudness, Eli noted, appeared to be a quality that the younger Harlow had shed somewhere between the saloon floor and this street, along with other things. "I've been listening from the top of the road for the last 10 minutes. He shifted the crutch. "I heard what he said." "Preston, you told me a man's worth is measured by what he builds," Preston said. "You said that my whole life. Building's operations influence. What a man can make other men do." He looked at Eli, at the scar, at the worn peacemaker, at the scarred hands. Then he looked back at his father. "You built all of this on something you stole from a man you shot in the back." He paused. "I almost killed a woman tonight because she wouldn't dance with me. Because you raised me to believe that being told no was an insult that required a response." He looked at the crutch in his hand. "I think we've both been very wrong about what a man's worth is measured by." Edmund stared at his son. The silence that followed was not the silence of the saloon, not the shocked, suffocating silence of 40 men confronted with violence. It was a different kind of silence, older, the silence of a reckoning that has been too long arriving. Edmund Harlow looked at his son for a long moment. He looked at the crutch. He looked at the dragging right leg that was the mirror of his own dragging left. He looked at the clear eyes that were looking back at him without deference, without fear for perhaps the first time. Then he looked at Eli Cord, and something in Edmund Harlow, something that had been clenched for 19 years, held together by will and calculation and the daily maintenance of a lie let go. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to a casual observer. But Eli saw it, because Eli had been looking for it. Edmund reached into his coat with 2 fingers. Slowly, deliberately telegraphing every movement. He produced the small Derringer, a 2-shot pocket pistol, nickel-plated, the kind of weapon a man carries when he wants something that cannot be seen. He held it out to the side at arm's length and released it. It fell into the snow with a small, conclusive sound. He straightened. "I'll be at the estate when your marshals arrive," he said to Eli. His voice was steady again, but it was a different steadiness now, not the controlled invincibility of before, but something more like the flatness of exhausted acceptance. "I'll receive them properly." He turned. He walked back toward the hill road, leaning on his cane, his left leg dragging its familiar pattern in the snow. He did not look back. Preston stood beside Eli and watched him go. The two of them stood in the snow for a while without speaking. The wind had dropped to almost nothing in the last few minutes, and the snow was falling straight down now. Large, slow flakes that accumulated on the shoulders of their coats and on the brim of Eli's hat, and on the surface of the street in a layer of white that was already beginning to smooth over the boot prints and the violence and the long night's record. "What happens to him?" Preston asked finally. "Federal jurisdiction," Eli said. "Fraud, falsified land claims, documented payments to territorial officials. What the marshals find when they audit the accounts will determine the rest." He paused. He's 61 years old, and he walks with a cane. He'll spend whatever time he has left in federal proceedings. That's not nothing. Preston nodded slowly. And the town? The mine reverts to federal jurisdiction while the claim is reviewed. The men keep working. The government will need the operation maintained. Eventually, the claim will be properly adjudicated and assigned. Eli looked down the street at the dark storefronts, at the false-fronted buildings standing in the falling snow. Bitter Creek can be something other than what it's been. Whether it manages that is up to the people in it. Preston looked at the ruined saloon. I shot that woman, he said. It came out without preamble, not as confession exactly, but as the statement of a fact that needed to be said aloud by the person responsible for making it true. You did, Eli said. She's alive. Last I knew, Halverson is good. Preston closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked older than he had in the saloon, which was not a bad thing. I'll need to answer for that. Yes, Eli said. You will. Nothing more was said about it. Some things don't require more. Doc Halverson met Eli at the clinic door just after 7 in the morning, in the first real daylight Bitter Creek had seen in 4 days, thin and cold, and filtered through low cloud but genuine sunlight nonetheless, doing what it could. She's awake, Halverson said. He stepped aside. The clinic was a single room above the Mercantile on the east side of Main Street, small, carbolic-smelling functional in the particular way of rooms that exist to do one specific thing and have long since shed any pretense of comfort. There was a bed, a table with instruments, a window facing east that let in the morning light. Della Marsh was propped slightly upright against the pillow. Her left shoulder heavily bandaged her face, the particular color of someone who has lost significant blood and has only recently been persuaded back from the edge of something permanent. Her dark hair was loose. The leather notebook was on the table beside the bed. Gideon must have brought it up when they moved her from the saloon floor. She looked at Eli when he came in. Her eyes were tired but clear. He took off his hat. He stood near the door, not approaching, giving her the option of the distance, the way you give a person who has been through something the option of determining how much of the world they want near them. I saw you, she said. Her voice was rough but steady. In the saloon. Before? She stopped. I saw you stand up. I know. You locked the door, she said. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. Did you know it was going to happen before it did? It was a question that deserved an honest answer, and Eli considered it as such. I knew something was going to happen, he said finally. I didn't know it would be you. She accepted this. Outside the window, the snow was still falling quieter now. The town below was beginning to produce its morning sounds, movement, the distant noise of the mine beginning its day's work, voices on the street. Halverson says I'll be all right, she said. Eventually. He's right. He also says I shouldn't be moved for at least 3 weeks. She looked at the ceiling for a moment and then back at him. Gideon says he'll keep my wages running while I'm laid up, and that some man left something in my notebook. She glanced at the table. Eli reached out and picked up the notebook. He opened it to the page where he had tucked the folded bank draft 2 hours earlier, then carried it to the bedside table and set it back down in front of her. She opened it. She looked at the draft. She looked at it for a long time. The amount was enough to cover St. Agatha's Home for Children operating expenses for 5 years, with sufficient remainder to add 2 additional rooms to the existing building. She looked up at him. This is, she started. It's from a copper claim, Eli said, that was owed to me for a long time. Call it interest. Della looked down at the draft, then at the notebook, then at the list of 31 names in her careful, slanted handwriting. She found the 4th name, Clara, and rested her finger on it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook. What's your name? She asked. Your real name? Not what they're calling you out there. Eli paused at the door. He turned back to look at her, this young woman with the steel spine and the notebook full of children's names who had said one quiet word to an arrogant drunk and had nearly died for the dignity of it. For the first time that night, through all of it, the locked door. The The confrontation, the siege, the long, cold standoff in the street, something that was not quite a smile and was more than nothing, moved across Eli Cord's weathered face. "Cord," he said. Eli Cord. He put his hat back on. He walked down the stairs and out through the Mercantile's front door and into the cold morning air of Bitter Creek, Wyoming, where the snow was falling straight and gentle, now covering everything equally, and the light was coming up slow and gray and honest over the edge of the territory. He went to the livery. His roan gelding was there, fed and watered, better rested than Eli was. He saddled the animal with the methodical attention of a man performing a familiar task, checked the cinch, checked the saddlebags. Everything where it should be. He swung up. He sat for a moment in the livery doorway, looking out at Main Street, the ruined facade of the Rusty Nail at the far end. The tracks in the snow from the night's events already being softened by the continued fall. The thin smoke beginning to rise from chimney pipes as the town started its morning fires. A few figures moving on the boardwalks, miners, heading to the mine, a woman crossing the street with a basket. Two men standing at the corner talking in low voices and glancing occasionally toward the Harlow estate on the hill. At the top of the hill road, just visible through the falling snow, a group of riders was coming down from the north. 6 men moving at a steady pace, the kind of pace that professional men maintain when they are not in a hurry, because they have already calculated that they are where they need to be when they need to be there. The morning light caught the glint of something on the lead rider's coat, a federal badge catching what sun there was. The marshals from Cheyenne. Eli watched them come down the hill. He watched them pass the estate at the top and continue toward Main Street. He watched Gideon Pruitt emerge from the damaged saloon and step out to meet them, the thick envelope in his hand. He watched until the marshals reached the street and the first of them spoke to Gideon, and Gideon gestured toward the estate, and the whole machinery of federal accountability began its slow and deliberate operation. Then Eli Cord turned his roan gelding toward the south road. He rode at a walk through the silent streets of Bitter Creek. Past the clinic window on the east side of Main Street, where a lamp burned yellow in the thin morning light. Past the Mercantile and the telegraph office and the boarding house where Mrs. Aldrich was just opening her front shutters. Past the mine road with its frozen wagon ruts and its distant sounds of machinery starting up for the day. Past the edge of town where the false-fronted buildings gave way to open country and the road became a track, and the track became suggestion, and the suggestion became the vast, blinding white expanse of the Wyoming Territory in November, stretching away in every direction under a sky that was beginning very slowly to let some light through. He did not look back. He rode south through the falling snow, the roan's breath making small clouds in the cold air. The only sound the soft percussion of hooves on snow and the occasional creak of saddle leather, and the wind, low and steady, moving across the open land with the absolute indifference of geography. In his coat pocket, the smooth granite stone rested in its familiar position against his hip. He had carried it for 19 years, a piece of the Colorado Territory, picked up on the morning after he had dug himself out of the snow, and understood that he was alive, and that surviving and living were two different things, and that he would need to decide which one he intended to do. He had been working on that question for 19 years. The road ahead was open, and the snow was clean, and the light was growing slowly stronger in the eastern sky, and there was no one behind him who required anything further from Eli Cord. The legend of the Colorado ghost would be told in Bitter Creek for decades in the rebuilt Rusty Nail, in the letters that Delamarche wrote to Sister Margaret at St. Agatha's home, in the testimony that Preston Harlow gave him to the federal court in Cheyenne the following spring, in language that was honest and without excuse. It would be told by the miners who had stood against the walls and watched and said nothing, and then gone home that night and thought about what it meant that they had said nothing. Some of them changed after that. Some of them didn't. That was generally the way of it. Edmund Harlow stood trial in Cheyenne in the spring of 1884. The evidence was comprehensive, and the proceedings were thorough. He was 62 years old by the time the verdict came down, and he received it in the particular silence of a man who has known for a long time that this was coming, and who has, in the long months of waiting, arrived at some kind of accommodation with the fact. The copper mine passed to federal jurisdiction and was later reorganized as a worker-managed operation, the claim adjudicated in a manner that acknowledged the original fraudulent filing and distributed the proceeds accordingly. Bitter Creek did not become a different kind of town overnight. It became slowly over years a slightly better version of the kind of town it had always been, which is generally speaking the most that can be hoped for. Della Marsh stayed in Bitter Creek through the winter and into the spring. When the roads cleared enough for travel, she made the journey to St. Louis, the first time she had been back since she'd left. She spent 3 weeks at St. Agatha's home, sleeping in the small room Sister Margaret kept for visitors, helping with the younger children in the mornings and sitting with Clara in the evenings. The building fund that arrived with her allowed for 2 new dormitory rooms and a proper kitchen, and the groundbreaking for the addition took place on a warm May morning with 32 children watching from the yard. She was back in Bitter Creek by June. The rebuilt Rusty Nail had better windows. Clement had a new piano with all its keys. Preston Harlow answered for his actions in a proceeding that was neither comfortable nor brief. He was not imprisoned, there was no prior record, and the circumstances, while damning, involved sufficient complexity that the court's judgment fell short of incarceration. He was required to remain in Wyoming Territory, to report monthly to the federal court, and to perform a period of compensated service in whatever capacity the court determined. He spent the first year as a clerk in the newly established federal land office in Bitter Creek, which required him to sit across a desk from miners and townspeople all day and process their paperwork with accuracy and without attitude. It was in its way a thorough education. He kept the silver-plated Colt in the bottom of a trunk in the room he rented above the hardware store. He did not take it out. He was not certain for a long time that he deserved to. Eventually he was, but that is a different story, and it belongs to Preston, and he will have to tell it himself. As for Eli, who had the Colorado ghost, the nameless drifter, the man who walked into Bitter Creek on a roan gelding with gold dust and a sealed envelope and a 19-year-old debt to collect, there are different accounts of where he went after he rode south out of town on that cold November morning. Some say he was seen in the spring in Colorado Territory near the area of the original survey. Some say he filed new land claims under his own name through the federal office in Denver, using documentation that had been held in trust by parties unknown for nearly 2 decades. Some say he built something. A modest something, nothing like an empire, nothing designed to make other people feel small. Something that sat level on the land and kept the weather out and was exactly as large as it needed to be. That part is probably true. Justice in Bitter Creek's telling of it always came back around. It just took 19 years to get there, and it traveled the long way through snow and patience and the particular stubbornness of a man who refused to stay dead. Which is, when you think about it, the only way justice ever really arrives. Not in a rush, not with fanfare, but it arrives.